Betrayal doesn't roar. It creeps in through the crack under a door, quiet as a shadow. When an Omega discovers his future is nothing but a pawn's gambit to a man he trusted, the world doesn't end in fire. It ends in a sterile hallway, smelling of expensive cologne and cheap lies. A broken promise pushed him out of a penthouse and straight into the sights of the city's most dangerous predator. But sometimes a monster is exactly what it takes to kill a ghost. Jude did not drop a glass. He did not gasp. He simply stood in the shadow of the sprawling penthouse foyer, the heavy bags of groceries digging grooves into his palms, and listened to the man he was supposed to marry negotiate his disposal. The oak door to the study was ajar by 2 inches. It was enough. "I'm aware of the optics, Richard," Gideon was saying. His voice was the same smooth, polished baritone that had whispered promises into Jude's ear for 4 years. Now it was stripped of warmth, reduced to the transactional clip of a boardroom. "But an Omega cannot sit on the holding board. The bylaws are archaic, yes, but they are ironclad. If I marry him, I forfeit the primary shares." A pause. The muffled scratch of a voice on the other end of the phone. "No, he doesn't know," Gideon replied, annoyed now. "I'll handle it after the quarterly gala, a generous severance. The deed to the townhouse in the lower district, perhaps a stipend. He's practical. He'll understand it's just business." Jude looked down at his left hand. The diamond on his ring finger caught the dim light of the hallway sconces. It looked heavy. Suddenly it felt like a shackle. He didn't feel anger, not yet. What he felt was a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had spent 4 years molding himself into the perfect companion for a rising corporate alpha. He had suppressed his heat cycles with punishing synthetic drugs so he wouldn't disrupt Gideon's schedule. He had smiled at dinners with arrogant executives who looked at him like a well-groomed pet. He had swallowed his own ambitions to prop up Gideon's. A generous severance. Jude set the groceries down on the marble floor. He moved without making a sound. He didn't go to the study. Confrontation was for people who still believed they could salvage something from the wreckage. Jude knew a dead thing when he saw it. He walked into the master bedroom. The air smelled of Gideon, crisp cedar and bergamot. It used to make Jude's pulse steady. Now it smelled cloying, like a funeral parlor masked in heavy perfume. He pulled a single duffel bag from the back of the closet. He packed functionally: jeans, heavy sweaters, a pair of boots. He left the tailored suits Gideon had bought him. He left the silk shirts. He went to the bathroom cabinet and swept the remaining bottles of his suppressant medication into his kit. That was the only thing of real value. In this city, an unbonded Omega without chemical control was a walking target. Finally, he stood before the mirror. He looked pale. The faint, bruised shadows under his eyes were a testament to the latest dosage hike of his suppressors. He twisted the diamond ring off his finger. It slid easily, too easily. He left it on the granite countertop right next to Gideon's expensive razor. Jude walked out the front door and took the service elevator down to the garage. He didn't look back. The moment the heavy metal doors of the lobby slid shut behind him, the skies over the city broke open, releasing a torrential, freezing downpour. He stepped into the rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow, shocking his system, snapping the final frayed thread of the bond he had cultivated in his mind. For the first time in 4 years, Jude breathed air that didn't belong to Gideon. It tasted like exhaust and wet concrete. It tasted like nothing. The city did not care about broken hearts. It only cared about vulnerability. By midnight, Jude was soaked to the bone. The temperature had plummeted, turning the rain into a biting sleet. He had been walking for hours, his boots squelching on the pavement, drifting further and further from the glittering glass towers of the financial district. His bank cards were useless. Gideon monitored every transaction. A single swipe at a hotel would send an alert to Gideon's phone, and Jude would be dragged back to the penthouse, subjected to gaslighting, apologies, and the suffocating control he had just escaped. He needed cash, which he didn't have, and he needed a place to hide. He crossed the bridge into the Narrows. The Narrows was the industrial gut of the city. Brick warehouses, rusted shipping containers, and neon signs buzzing with failing electricity. It was Alpha territory, rough, unregulated, and dangerous. Jude hugged the shadows, pulling the collar of his wet jacket up to mask the scent glands on his neck. The rain helped, washing away his natural scent, a soft, muted note of bruised honey and ash, but it wouldn't hide him forever. His body was already reacting to the stress. The adrenaline crash was setting in, and a deep, aching fatigue settled in his joints. Worse, a dull throb started at the base of his spine. His cycle was destabilizing. The shock of the emotional severing was overriding the synthetic drugs in his system. He passed a group of men huddled under a corrugated tin awning. One of them, a broad-shouldered alpha with a jagged scar across his jaw, stopped talking. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Jude froze. He kept his head down and walked faster. "Hey!" a gravelly voice called out over the hiss of the rain. "You lost, sweetheart? Awfully late for a stray." Footsteps splashed on the pavement behind him. Heavy, purposeful. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Jude's numbness. He broke into a jog, rounding a corner into a narrow alleyway. The shadows swallowed him, but the footsteps sped up. He was being hunted. He needed a door. Any door. At the end of the alley, a dull red light bled from a heavily reinforced steel door. There were no signs, no bouncers, just a security camera swiveling slowly above the frame. Jude didn't care what was inside. He lunged for the heavy iron handle, throwing his weight against it. It didn't budge. The footsteps behind him were closing in. He could hear the low, guttural growl of the alpha, the predatory hum that resonated in the chest of an unbonded male catching the scent of a vulnerable Omega. Jude shoved his hand into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the heavy brass keychain he still carried. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all he had. He slammed his shoulder against the door again. This time, the heavy latch clicked. Someone on the inside had buzzed it open. Jude fell through the threshold just as a massive hand swiped at the air where his jacket had been a second before. He kicked the door shut with his heel, listening to the heavy deadbolts engage with a mechanized clack, clack, clack. He collapsed against the cold steel, gasping for air, his chest heaving. The sound of the rain was instantly cut off, replaced by a low, throbbing bass that vibrated through the floorboards. He was in a long, dimly lit corridor. The air was thick. It didn't smell like cheap beer or sweat. It smelled like expensive tobacco, ozone, and danger. Dominant alphas, plural. The scent was so oppressive it made the fine hairs on Jude's arms stand up. He had escaped a street-level predator only to lock himself in a cage with something much bigger. Jude pushed himself off the door, his wet boots squeaking on the polished concrete floor. He needed to find a back exit, a fire escape, anything. He crept down the hallway, ignoring the heavy oak doors that lined the walls. Muffled voices leaked from a few of them, the clinking of glasses. He took a left at a fork in the corridor, aiming for what looked like a loading dock exit sign. He didn't make it. A hand, large and calloused, clamped onto his shoulder like a vice. Jude reacted on pure instinct, spinning and swinging his brass keychain at the man's face. The man caught Jude's wrist midair with insulting ease. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a tailored black suit that strained against his shoulders. He didn't even blink at Jude's attempt to strike him. "Well," the enforcer said, his voice a low rumble. "Look what washed in." He twisted Jude's arm behind his back, not enough to break it, but enough to immobilize him instantly. Another man stepped out from the shadows, equally massive, a suppressed pistol resting casually against his thigh. "Search him," the second man said. They patted him down, tossing his duffel bag to the floor and unzipping it. When they found the bottles of suppressants, the second man sneered. Omega. Drenched in street rain, trying to crash the back rooms. "Take him to the boss," the man holding Jude said. "He hates rats." Jude didn't struggle. He was too tired. The bone-deep exhaustion had returned, heavier than before. He let them drag him down another hallway, through a set of heavy doubles doors and into a sprawling, cavernous office. The room was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the churning black water of the docks. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat a man. "Boss, caught this one trying to sneak through the east corridor." The man at the desk didn't look up immediately. He was signing a document, his pen scratching rhythmically across the heavy paper. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with a pressure that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with the man himself. This was Victor. Jude didn't know his last name, didn't know the specifics of his syndicate, but he knew the face. Everyone in the city knew the face, though they pretended they didn't. Victor controlled the ports, the underground casinos, and half the politicians Gideon courted. He was a phantom wrapped in tailored wool, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to order a city block leveled. Victor set the pen down. He raised his head. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and unreadable. He looked older than Gideon, mid-40s perhaps, silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. A faint, jagged scar tracked from his left ear down to his collar line, disappearing beneath the crisp white collar of his shirt. He didn't emit a suffocating cloud of dominance like the street alphas or the arrogant executives Jude was used to. Victor's scent was entirely contained, a subtle, dark undertone of crushed asphalt, black coffee, and static electricity. It was the scent of a man completely in control of his nature. Victor looked at Jude. He took in the soaking wet clothes, the shivering frame, the bruises forming under Jude's eyes, and finally, the men holding his arms. "Let him go," Victor said. His voice was quiet, but it vibrated in Jude's chest. The enforcers instantly released Jude and stepped back, retreating to the edges of the room like shadows. Jude stood there, water dripping from his hair onto the expensive Persian rug. He rubbed his aching shoulder, refusing to break eye contact with the man behind the desk. He expected Victor to threaten him, to demand to know who sent him, to pull a weapon. Instead, Victor reached over to a crystal decanter on his desk. He poured a short measure of amber liquid into a glass. "You look like you're going to shatter," Victor said, his tone devoid of pity, merely stating a fact. "Who are you running from?" Jude let out a short, harsh laugh. It sounded like scraping metal. "Myself, mostly. I made a bad investment." Victor's eyebrows twitched, a microscopic gesture of interest. He stood up, picked up the glass, and walked around the desk. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace for a man his size. He stopped 3 feet from Jude, holding out the glass. "Drink," Victor commanded. Jude took the glass. His fingers brushed Victor's, and a jolt of static snapped between them. Jude flinched, but Victor's hand remained perfectly steady. Jude downed the whiskey in one swallow. It burned a fiery path down his throat, pooling warmly in his empty stomach. It grounded him, just a fraction. "I didn't break in to steal anything," Jude said, his voice raspy. I was being followed by one of the strays in the alley. The door was unlocked. I took a chance." "My door is never unlocked," Victor said softly. "Unless I want it to be." Victor stepped closer. The proximity was deliberate, a test. Most Omegas would have shrunk back, baring their necks in a subconscious display of submission to an alpha of Victor's caliber. Jude just looked at him, his spine rigid, his jaw set. Victor reached out and took Jude's left hand. Jude tensed, but didn't pull away. Victor's thumb brushed the pale, untanned band of skin on Jude's ring finger, the ghost of an engagement ring. "Recent," Victor murmured, his slate eyes snapping back up to Jude's face. "The scent of another alpha is still clinging to you, though it's turning sour, rotting, a severed bond. And yet, you aren't weeping. You aren't begging my men for mercy. You walked into a cartel front and asked for a drink." "I didn't ask," Jude corrected dryly. "You poured it." A low rumble started in Victor's chest. It took Jude a second to realize the terrifying mafia boss was laughing. It was a dark, private sound. "What is your name?" Victor asked. "Jude." Well, Jude, you have a problem, Victor said, dropping Jude's hand and stepping back to lean against his desk. You are an unbonded Omega in the middle of a biological crash, carrying a bag full of black market suppressants, standing in the office of a man who makes a living making people disappear. By all logic, you should be terrified. Jart, I'm too tired to be terrified, Jude said honestly. The whiskey was making his limbs heavy, but his mind felt terrifyingly clear. My fiancé just threw away 5 years of my life because I don't have the right corporate pedigree to sit on his board. I have no money, nowhere to sleep, and my biology is currently tearing itself apart trying to figure out why its alpha is gone. So, if you're going to shoot me, do it. If you're going to throw me back into the alley, do it. I really don't care. Silence stretched over the room. The rain battered against the reinforced glass windows, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet tension. Victor studied him. He didn't see a victim. He saw a survivor holding himself together with sheer, cynical spite. It was the most interesting thing Victor had seen in a decade. In Victor's world, loyalty was bought with fear or money, both of which were fragile. But a man with nothing left to lose, who looked death in the face and asked for a whiskey, that was rare. Who was the Alpha? Victor asked. Gideon Hayes. Victor recognized the name, a rising star in the tech logistics sector, arrogant, pedestrian, a man who thought he understood power because he had a high credit limit. Hayes is a fool, Victor said flatly. He throws away a diamond because he thinks he needs a brick. Jude blinked, startled by the blunt assessment. He needs a board seat. He needs a lesson in consequences, Victor corrected. He crossed his arms, the bespoke fabric of his suit pulling taut. You have nowhere to go, Jude. The streets will eat you alive by morning, and your suppressants will fail by noon, but I have a proposition for you. Jude narrowed his eyes. I don't do sex work, and I don't mule drugs. I have enough whores and mules, Victor said dismissively. I need something much harder to find. I need a legitimate face. I need someone who understands the high society rot from the inside out. Someone who can navigate the galas and the boardrooms that look down on my money. Someone who isn't intimidated by alphas throwing their weight around. Victor pushed off the desk and closed the distance between them again. I offer you a sanctuary, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, magnetic register. A suite in my territory, protection, access to my private medical staff to manage your crash. No one will touch you, not the streets, not my men, and certainly not Gideon Hayes. Jude stared at him, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And in return? In return, Victor said, his slate eyes gleaming with a predatory calculating light, you belong to my organization. You wear my crest, you sit at my side at public functions, and you help me dismantle the corporate empire of the men who think they own this city. We start with Gideon Hayes. Jude stood frozen. The offer was madness. It was a deal with the devil. But as he looked into Victor's eyes, he didn't see the deceit he had endured for 4 years. He saw absolute, brutal honesty. Gideon had wanted a quiet, obedient shadow. Victor wanted a weapon. Jude looked down at his empty left hand, then back up at the Mafia Boss. I'm going to need a dry change of clothes, Jude said. Victor smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. Welcome to the family, Jude. The crash hit Jude 3 days later. It didn't announce itself with a gentle decline. It kicked the door down. He woke up at 3 a.m. in the guest suite of Victor's fortified estate, his sheets soaked in cold sweat. His joints felt like they were packed with crushed glass. His lungs burned, dragging in air that tasted like copper and bile. The synthetic suppressants were finally gone from his bloodstream. In their absence, his biology was staging a violent revolt. His body was looking for the alpha it had been chemically tricked into believing was permanent. It found nothing. Jude barely made it to the ensuite bathroom before his stomach heaved. He collapsed against the cold marble tiles, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. The fever was spiking, blurring his vision, turning the heavy, expensive fixtures of the bathroom into warped, looming shapes. He didn't call for help. He curled into a tight ball on the floor, pressing his forehead against the stone, waiting for the wave to pass. It didn't. The bathroom door clicked open. Jude flinched, squeezing his eyes shut. He expected an enforcer. He expected a maid. "Bennett," a voice said. Calm, deep, unbothered. "Get the IV set up." Jude pried his eyes open. Victor stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark unbuttoned dress shirt and slacks, holding a glass of ice water. Behind him, an older man with a weathered face and a medical bag stepped into the room. Jude tried to push himself up, a primal humiliation flooding his chest. He was an Omega, weak and thrashing on the floor, entirely at the mercy of an Alpha he barely knew. "Get out!" Jude choked out. His voice sounded wrecked. Victor didn't leave. He didn't offer a pitying look either. He just crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing his intent so he wouldn't trigger Jude's panicked instincts. "You're in withdrawal," Victor said flatly. "Your nervous system is misfiring. If you try to stand, you will crack your skull on the vanity, and I will have to clean blood off the marble. Stay down." Dr. Bennett knelt beside Jude, tying a tourniquet around his trembling arm. "It's a standard biological reset, Mr. Jude. The fever is your body burning out the remaining synthetics. I'm giving you fluids, a mild sedative, and a non-hormonal painkiller." Jude hissed as the needle pierced his vein. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away from Victor. "This is pathetic." "This is chemistry," Victor corrected. Victor sat down on the edge of the large bathtub, crossing his arms. He didn't emit a soothing pheromone cloud to placate Jude. Gideon used to do that whenever Jude was upset, flood the room with heavy, commanding alpha scent to forcibly calm him down. It was a biological override, a leash. Victor offered nothing but cold, quiet presence. It was bracing. It respected Jude's autonomy, even as his body rebelled against it. "How long?" Jude asked, his voice raw. 72 hours, Bennett answered, taping the IV line to Jude's skin. "The worst of it will peak tonight. You'll feel like you're dying. You aren't." Bennett finished setting up the drip on a portable stand and quietly backed out of the bathroom, pulling the door shut behind him. Jude lay on the tiles, the cool saline slowly dripping into his blood. He felt pathetic. He felt exposed. But as he looked up at Victor, who was casually inspecting his own cufflink, Jude realized something strange. He didn't feel hunted. "Why are you here?" Jude asked. Victor looked down. "My investment is currently lying on the floor. I protect my investments." "You could have let the doctor handle it." "I could have," Victor agreed. He took a sip of his ice water. "But you're accustomed to men who hide behind closed doors when things get unpleasant. Gideon liked his messes out of sight. I prefer to watch mine." Jude let out a bitter, exhausted breath. "I'm not a mess. I'm just recalibrating." Victor's mouth twitched. "Recalibrating, a good word for it. Rest, Jude. The war doesn't start until you can walk without stumbling." For the next 3 days, Jude lived in a hazy purgatory of fever dreams and bone-deep aches. And for 3 days, Victor's compound operated around him with silent efficiency. No one pitied him. No one looked at him with the condescending sorrow he despised. They brought him broth, checked his vitals, and left him alone. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Jude woke up in the massive 4-poster bed. The sunlight streaming through the reinforced windows didn't hurt his eyes anymore. His head was clear. His skin felt cool. He sat up. He took a deep breath. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't smell the synthetic sweetness of suppressants in his own sweat. He smelled himself. Rainwater, bruised honey, ash. He was entirely his own, and he was furious. The war room was located in the sub-basement of the estate. It didn't look like a mobster's den. It looked like a hedge fund's trading floor. Banks of encrypted servers hummed behind glass walls. Monitors displayed shipping routes, stock fluctuations, and property deeds. Jude walked in wearing a tailored black suit. It was not the soft pastel silks Gideon had preferred him to wear. The lines were sharp, the shoulders structured. It was armor. Victor was standing at a central glass table, looking over a series of printed manifests. He glanced up as Jude approached. He took in the change in Jude's posture. The slump was gone. The hesitation was gone. The Omega standing before him looked like a drawn blade. "You're upright," Victor noted. "I'm ready," Jude said. He walked to the other side of the glass table, bracing his hands on the edge. He didn't wait for permission. "Show me what you have on Gideon." Victor slid a thick manila folder across the smooth surface. "Gideon Hayes, CEO of Hayes Logistics. He moves consumer goods, electronics, pharmaceuticals, clean, boring, very profitable." Jude flipped open the folder. He saw photographs of Gideon at charity dinners, spreadsheets of legitimate shell companies, board member profiles. It was a thorough dossier, but it was superficial. "This is the public face," Jude said, pushing the folder back. "This is what he wants you to see." "And what aren't I seeing?" Victor asked, leaning forward, resting his knuckles on the glass. "Gideon is a creature of habit and paranoia," Jude said, his voice hard. "He doesn't trust digital ledgers for his most sensitive Hay accounts. He thinks they leave a trail." Jude reached for a dry erase marker resting on the table. He uncapped it and started drawing a flowchart directly onto the glass tabletop. "Hayes Logistics has a subsidiary called Apex Freight," Jude said, drawing a hard box. "On paper, it handles overflow shipping. In reality, it's a slush fund. He uses it to funnel kickbacks to the union bosses at the southern ports to ensure his ships get priority docking. No delays, no inspections. That's how he undercuts your shipping fronts on delivery times." Victor stared at the box drawn on the glass. His eyes narrowed. "I control the southern ports. You control the harbor master," Jude corrected, tapping the glass. "Gideon pays the dock workers directly, cash. He has an accountant, a man named Arthur Vance, who physically drives a briefcase of bearer bonds down to the docks on the last Friday of every month." The silence in the room shifted. It grew dense, heavy with sudden electric potential. Victor looked from the chart to Jude. "How do you know this?" Victor asked quietly. "Because for 4 years, I was the one who packed Gideon's overnight bag when he visited the southern offices," Jude said, his gaze meeting Victor's without flinching. "I saw the withdrawal slips. I noticed the dates. Gideon thought I was too busy picking out floral arrangements to understand balance sheets. He left his home safe unlocked twice. I possess a photographic memory." Victor didn't smile, but a dangerous calculating light flared in his slate-gray eyes. He walked slowly around the table, stopping right next to Jude. The proximity was startling. Jude could feel the heat radiating off the Alpha, smell the dark, ozone-heavy scent of him. But Victor wasn't crowding him to assert dominance. He was looking at the chart. "Arthur Vance," Victor mused, tasting the name. "A creature of habit. He plays baccarat at the Continental Club every Thursday night," Jude said. "He loses, consistently. Gideon covers his debts to keep him loyal. If Arthur Vance were to misplace that briefcase this Friday," Victor said slowly, "the dock workers wouldn't get paid. They would strike," Jude finished. "Gideon has 3 container ships of perishable pharmaceuticals arriving on Saturday morning. If they sit in the harbor for even 48 hours, the cargo spoils. He loses $20 million in inventory, breaches his delivery contracts, and the board will demand an inquiry." Victor turned his head. His face was inches from Jude's. "You would burn his company to the ground over a broken engagement?" "I don't care about the engagement," Jude whispered. "I care about the 4 years he stole from me. I care about the drugs he forced me to take to keep me convenient. He wanted to throw me away with a generous severance. I want him to have nothing." Victor stared into Jude's eyes for a long, silent moment. Then he reached out and took the marker from Jude's hand. He drew a sharp red line through the box labeled Apex Freight. "Get me coal," Victor said over his shoulder, speaking to one of the shadows near the server banks. An enforcer stepped forward immediately. "Tell him we are making a withdrawal on Friday." Victor turned back to Jude. You needed a weapon, Jude. Consider me loaded. The Continental Club was an institution of old money and quiet vices. It smelled of aged leather, cigar smoke, and expensive bourbon. It was the kind of place where fortunes changed hands over a single hand of cards, and where Omegas were typically seen pouring drinks or draped decoratively over the arms of wealthy alphas. Jude walked through the brass-trimmed double doors, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was flanked by Victor. The visual was arresting. Victor, massive and radiating an aura of lethal, quiet power in a charcoal suit. And Jude, sharp, pale, and untouchable in jet black. They didn't walk in like a couple. They walked in like a firing squad. Jude scanned the main floor. The mahogany tables were crowded. Waitstaff in crisp white vests moved silently between the patrons. Corner table, Jude murmured, his lips barely moving. Near the pillar. Victor adjusted his cuffs, his eyes tracking instantly to the target. Arthur Vance. Gideon's accountant was a nervous, sweating beta in a suit that was too expensive for his frame. He was clutching a stack of chips, staring frantically at the baccarat dealer. "Wait here," Victor said. Jude stood by the heavy velvet drapes, watching as Victor crossed the room. The crowd naturally parted for the Mafia Boss. It was an instinctual reaction to a superior predator. Men paused their conversation, shifting uncomfortably as Victor glided past. Victor pulled out a chair opposite Arthur and sat down. He didn't introduce himself. He simply signaled a waiter, ordered a drink, and watched Arthur. Jude couldn't hear the conversation over the low hum of the club, but he didn't need to. He watched the psychology of it unfold. Arthur glanced at Victor, annoyed at first, then realization dawned. The beta's face went entirely slack. The blood drained from his cheeks. Victor leaned forward, resting his forearms on the green baize of the table. He said something short. Arthur's hands began to shake. He knocked over a stack of $100 chips. They scattered across the table, but he didn't try to pick them up. He looked terrified. Victor gestured casually toward the entrance. Arthur's eyes followed the gesture. They landed on Jude. For a second, Arthur looked confused. He knew Jude. He knew him as Gideon's quiet, obedient, heavily suppressed fiancé, the Omega who poured the tea when Arthur came to the penthouse to sign documents. Jude held Arthur's gaze across the crowded room. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He simply raised an eyebrow, a perfectly calculated expression of icy contempt. Arthur's mouth opened in a silent gasp. The puzzle pieces locked together in his mind. The Mafia Boss, the discarded Omega, the secrets. Arthur stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, hitting the floor with a loud crack that silenced the immediate vicinity. He didn't look back at Victor. He practically ran toward the exit, pushing past a waiter desperate to get out of the building. Victor stood up slowly. He adjusted his jacket, left a $100 bill on the table for a drink he hadn't touched, and walked back to Jude. "What did you say to him?" Jude asked as Victor reached him. "I told him I was aware of his itinerary for Friday," Victor said, his voice entirely conversational, "and I suggested he take an impromptu vacation to Europe, effective immediately." "And if he warns Gideon?" "He won't," Victor said, placing a hand lightly on the small of Jude's back, a protective, possessive gesture that sent a jolt of warmth through Jude's spine. "He knows Gideon cannot protect him from me. Gideon is a businessman. I am a monster." Arthur made the logical choice. Jude looked up at Victor. The brutal honesty was intoxicating. Gideon had always pretended to be a good man while doing terrible things in the shadows. Victor didn't pretend. He owned his darkness, and right now, he was letting Jude use it. "Let's go home," Victor said. "Friday's going to be a very busy day for Hayes Logistics." They turned and walked out of the club. Behind them, the whispers finally broke out, frantic and hushed. The high society of the city had just witnessed an earthquake. The quiet Omega they had all ignored had just walked in with the devil himself, and they had aimed straight for Gideon Hayes. The severance was over. The execution had begun. Friday arrived with the grinding inevitability of a glacier. At the southern docks, the morning fog hung low and thick over the water, smelling of diesel fuel and salt rot. By 8:00 a.m., the harbor master's office was supposed to receive the authorization codes for 3 massive container ships bearing the Hayes Logistics crest. The ships were loaded with temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, their internal cooling units running on auxiliary power. By 8:15 a.m., the longshoreman union representative, a man who usually had a very fat, very untraceable envelope of cash waiting for him in his locker, found it empty. By 8:30 a.m., the cranes stopped moving. The massive steel pulleys fell silent. The men in high-visibility vests sat down on wooden shipping crates, lit cigarettes, and refused to catch the mooring lines. Across the city, in a glass-walled boardroom suspended 40 floors above the financial district, Gideon Hayes checked his platinum wristwatch. It was 9:00 a.m. He sat at the head of a long, polished oak table. 7 board members sat around him, looking over the quarterly projections. Gideon was projecting calm, a predator entirely confident in his domain. His suit was perfectly tailored. His jawline was sharp. His scent, a heavy commanding pine and vetiver, filled the room, subtly asserting dominance over the betas and weaker alphas present. His phone buzzed flat against the table. A text from his chief of operations at the port. Union walked out. Ships anchored in the bay. "Where's Arthur?" Gideon's thumb hovered over the screen. A cold, microscopic prickle of irritation sparked at the base of his neck. Arthur was never late. Arthur was a sniveling, terrified creature of habit who relied on Gideon to keep his gambling debts from destroying his life. Gideon typed a quick reply. "Find him. Pay double from the emergency slush. Get those ships docked." 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. "Arthur's apartment is empty. Dorman said he left with 2 suitcases last night. Emergency slush account requires his biometric key. We are locked out." Gideon did not react outwardly. He did not curse. He simply turned his phone face down on the oak table. He looked at the board members, offering a practiced, razor-thin smile. "Excuse me for a moment, gentlemen, a minor logistical bottleneck." He stepped out of the boardroom and walked into his private office, closing the heavy, soundproof door behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the facade dropped. He crossed the room and slammed his fist onto his desk, the heavy thud vibrating through the floorboards. "Arthur, you stupid, pathetic little man," Gideon hissed to the empty room. He yanked his desk phone off the receiver and dialed his security chief. "Track Arthur down. Now. Check the airports, the train stations. If you find him, break his knees and bring him to the warehouse. And get me a line of credit from the Cayman accounts. We have 48 hours before those cooling units fail on the ships." Gideon hung up. He dragged a hand through his perfectly styled hair. This was a temporary setback, a minor annoyance. He had built his empire on efficiency and ruthlessness. He would crush this union strike by the afternoon. Then he saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on his immaculate leather desk blotter was a standard, unmarked manila envelope. It hadn't been there when he arrived this morning. Gideon stared at it. His security was impenetrable. No one entered his office without his assistant clearing them. He walked slowly around the desk, his heart beating a hard, suspicious rhythm against his ribs. He picked up a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open. A single piece of paper slid out. It was a photocopy of the internal ledger for Apex Freight, the slush fund, the specific page detailing the union payouts for the last 6 months. In the bottom right corner, someone had circled a specific transaction in red ink. Beside it, written in neat, precise cursive, were 3 words. "Your math is wrong." Gideon stopped breathing. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on grocery lists, on dry cleaning notes, on the back of anniversary cards he barely read. He knew the precise loop of the Y, the sharp slant of the T. Jude. The name echoed in Gideon's mind, not as a threat, but as an impossibility. Jude was soft. Jude was compliant. Jude was currently supposed to be weeping in some cheap motel in the lower districts, mourning the loss of the penthouse and the wedding ring. Gideon dropped the paper onto the desk. A low, dangerous growl rattled in his chest. His alpha instincts, accustomed to absolute submission, flared with violent indignation. His property was acting out. His discarded Omega was throwing a tantrum. He snatched his phone and dialed his security chief again. "Cancel the search for Arthur," Gideon barked, his voice dripping with venom. "Find Jude. He's pulling some kind of stunt. I want him found. I want him suppressed, and I want him brought to me. He's going to learn what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." "Sir?" The security chief hesitated. "We ran a trace on the ex-fiancé yesterday, just to ensure he vacated the premises as instructed. We got a hit on a facial recognition camera in the Narrows." "The Narrows?" Gideon frowned. "What is he doing in the slums?" "He didn't stay in the slums, sir." The camera tracked him walking into a front operation. The man paused, the line crackling with static and fear. He walked into one of Victor's clubs, and he didn't walk out. The air in Gideon's office suddenly felt very thin. Victor. Gideon sank slowly into his leather executive chair. The puzzle pieces snapped together with bone-jarring violence. The missing accountant, the sudden strike, the ledger on his desk. Jude hadn't just run away. Jude had walked straight into the arms of the only man in the city with the resources, the power, and the sheer malice to dismantle Hayes Logistics piece by piece. Gideon stared at the red cursive on the ledger. It wasn't a tantrum, it was a declaration of war. The mayor's autumn gala was held in the glass atrium of the Botanical Gardens. It was the premier event of the season, a gilded cage where the city's elite gathered to trade favors, size up their rivals, and pretend their money was clean. Jude stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in Victor's guest wing, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. It was a deep midnight blue velvet, tailored so sharply it looked like it could cut glass. He wore no jewelry, no rings, no collar. Victor leaned against the door frame, watching him. He wore a traditional black tuxedo, the stark white of his shirt contrasting sharply with the dark olive of his skin and the silver at his temples. He looked like an apex predator in formal wear. "You are quiet tonight," Victor observed, his voice a low rumble that carried across the room. "I'm calculating," Jude replied, his eyes meeting Victor's in the mirror. "The ships have been anchored for 36 hours, Victor said, pushing off the doorframe and walking slowly into the room. "The pharmaceutical cargo is nearing critical temperature limits. Gideon's stock has dropped 6% since the market opened. His board is panicking. He is bleeding, Jude." "He won't die quietly," Jude said. He turned to face Victor. "He will corner me tonight. He relies on physical intimidation when his money fails." Victor stopped inches from Jude. The proximity sent a familiar grounding shockwave through Jude's nervous system. The heavy scent of crushed asphalt and ozone wrapped around him, but it didn't suffocate him. It acted as a shield. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, flat velvet box. He opened it. Inside lay a watch. It was vintage, a skeleton dial with intricate, exposed gears set on a band of matte black leather. "Give me your wrist," Victor commanded softly. Jude extended his left arm. Victor took it, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around Jude's pale wrist. He strapped the watch on, the cool metal pressing against Jude's pulse point. "He stole time from you," Victor said, his thumb brushing over the glass face of the watch. "He chemically halted your biology to fit his schedule. This is yours. You set the pace now. If he approaches you tonight, you do not look away. You do not lower your head. You let him see exactly what he created." Jude looked down at the exposed gears ticking rhythmically against his skin. He felt a sudden fierce burn in his chest. It wasn't the blind, desperate devotion he had felt for Gideon. It was respect. It was the intoxicating realization that this terrifying man saw him not as a liability, but as an equal. "I'm ready," Jude said. They arrived at the gala just after 9. The atrium was a sprawling jungle of rare orchids and towering ferns, illuminated by thousands of fairy lights strung through the glass ceiling. A string quartet played in the corner, barely audible over the low hum of expensive conversations. When Victor and Jude walked down the sweeping marble staircase, the hum died. The silence rippled outward like a dropped stone in a pond. Heads turned. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. The city's elite recognized Victor instantly, a dark stain on their pristine gathering. But the shock was reserved for the man walking beside him. Jude kept his chin parallel to the floor, his face an emotionless mask. He felt the weight of 100 stares. He felt the whispered gossip brushing against his skin. Isn't that Hayes's Omega, the quiet one? What is he doing with the syndicate? Victor didn't guide Jude by the waist. He walked half a step behind him, allowing Jude to lead the way into the crowd. It was a subtle, deliberate statement. Jude was not a captive. Jude was the vanguard. They made their way to a high cocktail table near the orchids. Jude ordered a gin. Neat. He took a sip, the ice burning cold against his tongue, and scanned the room. It took exactly 4 minutes for the predator to break cover. Gideon pushed through a cluster of city councilmen, his face tight, his eyes burning with a dark, frenzied rage. He had forgone his usual polished charm. He looked dangerous, a man watching his empire burn and desperately searching for the arsonist. He marched straight toward their table. Victor saw him coming, but didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Gideon with the detached interest of a biologist observing a rat in a maze. Gideon stopped 2 feet from Jude. He ignored Victor entirely. "What kind of game are you playing, Jude?" Gideon's voice was a low, vibrating hiss. He didn't care who heard him. Jude looked at him, really looked at him. For 4 years, Gideon had been the sun in Jude's sky, a blinding, untouchable force. Now, looking at the frantic tick in Gideon's jaw, the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, Jude realized the sun was just a dying star. "I don't play games, Gideon," Jude said, his voice perfectly level, carrying easily over the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests. "I correct accounting errors." Gideon's nostrils flared. His alpha instinct kicked in, an involuntary response to defiance. He released a heavy, suffocating wave of pheromones, a chemical command designed to force an Omega to their knees, to paralyze them with biological submission. The air grew thick, smelling sickeningly of sharp pine and aggression. A year ago, a month ago, Jude would have folded. His knees would have buckled. He would have lowered his eyes and apologized. Tonight, Jude just adjusted the cuff of his velvet jacket. His biology was clean. His mind was his own. And standing behind him was a man whose sheer presence neutralized Gideon's petty display of dominance. "It won't work anymore," Jude said softly, staring dead into Gideon's eyes. "I'm off your drugs, I'm out of your house, and I am entirely unimpressed." Gideon's face twisted in shock. The failure of his pheromones rattled him deeper than the loss of the cargo. He reached out, his hand snapping forward to grab Jude's arm. He never made contact. Victor's hand shot out with terrifying, viper-like speed. He caught Gideon's wrist in midair. The sound of Victor's grip locking onto the bone was a dull, sickening thud. Gideon gasped, trying to yank his arm back, but Victor's hold was like industrial steel. Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't flood the room with his own scent. He simply applied pressure. "Touch him," Victor whispered, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. "And I will break every bone in this hand. Then I will break the other one. And then you will sign your company over to me with a pen held in your teeth." Gideon went pale. He stared at Victor, finally acknowledging the Leviathan in the room. "You have no right," Gideon choked out, his arrogance crumbling into genuine fear. "He's my fiancé." "He was your hostage," Victor corrected, releasing Gideon's wrist with a violent shove that sent the younger Alpha stumbling backward into a waiter. Glasses shattered on the marble floor. The string quartet stopped playing. The entire atrium was staring. Gideon scrambled to regain his footing, his face flushed with profound public humiliation. He looked wildly at the crowd, at the board members who were watching him fall apart, and finally back at Jude. "You think he cares about you?" Gideon spat at Jude, desperation making him vicious. "He's using you to get to my ports. You're just trading one leash for another, you stupid little whore." Jude didn't flinch. He took a step forward, closing the distance, looking down at Gideon's trembling frame. "The difference, Gideon," Jude said, his voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room, "is that I handed him the leash, and I pointed him at you." Jude pulled his phone from his inner pocket. He tapped the screen twice. "Your cooling units failed 3 minutes ago," Jude stated, reading the encrypted message from Cole at the docks. $20 million of pharmaceuticals just became medical waste. Your delivery contracts are void. The union has officially signed an exclusive handling contract with Victor's syndicate. You have no cargo, you have no men, and as of Monday morning, you will have no board of directors. Gideon stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The reality of his absolute ruin crashed down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. He looked at Jude, searching for a trace of the submissive, loving Omega he had controlled for years. He found nothing but cold, black water. Jude turned away from him. He looked at Victor. "I'm bored," Jude said. "Take me home." Victor smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing that made the surrounding guests physically step back. He offered Jude his arm. Jude took it. They walked out of the botanical gardens, leaving Gideon Hayes kneeling in a puddle of shattered glass and spilled champagne, his empire bleeding out on the marble floor. The fallout did not arrive quietly. It was broadcast in high definition across 4 different financial networks. Jude sat in the subterranean war room, the glow of the massive flat-screen monitors casting cold, blue light across his face. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee. It had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He didn't drink it. He just let the heat leach out of the ceramic into his palms, grounding him in the present. On the screen, a news chopper tracked a convoy of federal vehicles pulling up to the Hayes Logistics Tower. The ticker at the bottom of the screen ran in a continuous, frantic loop of red text. Stock plummets 40%. Emergency board meeting convened. CEO Gideon Hayes detained amid sweeping corruption probe. The camera cut to a ground-level feed. The revolving glass doors of the lobby pushed open. Gideon emerged. He was flanked by 2 men in windbreakers. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The bespoke suit he had worn to the botanical gardens was wrinkled. His hair, usually a helmet of perfect styling, fell limply across his forehead. But it was his face that arrested Jude's attention. Gideon looked hollowed out. The arrogant, predatory Alpha who had commanded boardrooms and dictated Jude's biology was gone, replaced by a terrified man blinking into the harsh glare of camera flashes. Jude watched the man he had almost married get shoved into the back of a government sedan. He waited for the euphoria. He waited for the triumphant surge of vindication, the warm rush of a closed chapter. It didn't come. Instead, a profound, heavy emptiness settled in his chest. The white-hot anger that had sustained him through the agonizing biological withdrawal had burned itself out. The ghost was dead. Gideon was a neutralized threat. And Jude was suddenly, terrifyingly adrift. The heavy pneumatic seal of the war room door hissed, breaking the silence. Victor walked in. He did not look like a man who had just spent the weekend executing a hostile, multi-million-dollar corporate takeover. He looked like a man returning from a casual stroll. He had discarded his jacket somewhere in the upper levels of the estate. His stark white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and faint silver scars. He carried a thick black leather binder. He dropped it onto the center of the glass tactical table. The heavy thud echoed against the server racks. "The acquisition is finalized," Victor said. His voice was a low rumble, rougher than usual around the edges. "My holding companies have absorbed the viable assets. The southern ports are entirely locked down under our operational umbrella. The board voted Gideon out at 8:15 this morning. By 9, they were begging my representatives for a buyout." Jude set his cold coffee down on a coaster. He picked up the remote and pressed a button. The television screen snapped to black. The sudden silence in the server room felt dense, almost physical. "So," Jude said. He didn't look at the binder. He looked at his own reflection in the dead monitor. The transaction is concluded. I mapped the blind spots. I gave you the pressure points. You tore him down. Victor stopped near the edge of the glass table. He watched Jude carefully, his slate-gray eyes tracking the subtle tension in Jude's shoulders. It was a highly profitable weekend for the syndicate. Jude turned his chair slowly. He faced the Alpha. Am I receiving my severance package, Victor? The question hung in the air, sharp and unpadded. Jude refused to play games. He had spent 4 years navigating the unspoken rules of a man who viewed him as a decorative asset. He would not do it again. I don't have a home to return to, Jude continued, his voice perfectly level, stripping the emotion from the facts. I burned my bridge to high society down to the bedrock. The criminal underworld now knows exactly who I am. They know I am the Omega who handed a shipping empire to a cartel boss. If I walk out of this compound, I have a target on my back the size of the financial district. No one in this city would dare look at you, let alone touch you, Victor said. The temperature in this room seemed to drop. The dark, heavy scent of crushed asphalt and ozone spiked in the air, not as a threat to Jude, but as a territorial warning to the rest of the world. You wear my crest. You sit at my table. You are under my absolute protection. For how long? Jude challenged. He stood up. He didn't care about the size difference. He didn't care about the lethal capability resting in Victor's hands. Jude crossed the space between them, his jaw set. Until the novelty of a feral Omega wears off? Until you find another broken piece on the board to weaponize? Victor closed the remaining distance. He stood toe-to-toe with Jude. The sheer, overwhelming mass of the Alpha was a physical pressure, a gravitational pull. You think you are broken, Victor said softly. He raised a hand. He didn't grab Jude's jaw or force him to submit. He simply rested his large, calloused palm flat against the side of Jude's neck, right over his scent gland. His thumb brushed the erratic, racing pulse beneath Jude's skin. Gideon broke a heavily medicated, compliant doll, Victor murmured, looking down into Jude's eyes. What walked into my club, soaking wet and demanding whiskey, was something entirely different. It was something forged in pure, concentrated spite. Victor's grip on Jude's neck tightened just a fraction. It was grounding. Real. You asked me once why I brought you into this room, Victor said, his gaze burning with a terrifying, absolute honesty. I told you I needed a legitimate face for the galas. I lied. I have a building full of corporate lawyers for legitimacy. I brought you in here because you looked a monster in the eye and didn't blink. I kept you because you possess a mind as ruthless and cynical as my own. Jude's breath hitched. The air left his lungs. He stared up at the man who commanded an army of killers, the man who had sat on the edge of a bathtub and watched him sweat out the poison of his past without offering a single word of pity. I don't want a pet, Jude, Victor whispered. His lips were a breath away from Jude's face. I don't want an ornament. I want a partner. I want the man who engineered a $20 million collapse with a whiteboard marker and a steady hand. Victor dropped his hand from Jude's neck. He stepped back, severing the physical contact, leaving the choice entirely in the open air. The transaction is over, Victor said, his voice returning to its cool, unreadable baseline. The vault doors are open. You can walk out right now. I will wire enough untraceable funds into an offshore account for you to vanish anywhere on Earth. You will never see me again. Or you can stay. Jude looked at the heavy steel door. He looked at the bank of encrypted servers humming against the far wall, tracking illicit cargo across 3 continents. Then he looked at the magnificent, terrifying Alpha standing in front of him. He didn't want the soft pastel life. He didn't want the penthouse, the forced smiles, the chemical chains. He wanted the danger. He wanted the raw, bleeding edge of the world. He wanted the dark. Jude closed the distance. He grabbed the front of Victor's crisp white shirt, twisting the expensive cotton in his fists, and pulled the massive man downward. I'm not going anywhere, Jude said fiercely. When Victor kissed him, it was not gentle. It was not a romantic cinematic collision. It was a violent claiming, a sealing of a pact written in ruined empires and cold calculation. Jude kissed him back with the starving desperation of a man who had finally found the exact right type of oxygen. His hands tangled in the thick hair at the nape of Victor's neck, anchoring himself against the hurricane. Victor's arms wrapped around Jude's waist, lifting him slightly off the polished concrete floor, holding him with a possessive, unbreakable strength. They were two creatures of the dark, standing over the ashes of a man who thought he could control the world. The city outside continued to hum, blind and ignorant. They didn't know that the balance of power had permanently shifted over a cup of cold coffee. Gideon Hayes was a forgotten memory in a concrete holding cell, but down in the shadows of the Syndicate, a new empire was drawing its first breath, and at its center stood an Alpha who owned the city and the Omega who owned him. If you survived the betrayal and stayed for the revenge, hit that like button to let us know. Jude's journey from a suppressed pawn to a Syndicate kingpin proves that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the room is a broken heart with nothing left to lose. Want more intense, grounded Omegaverse drama with zero cliches and high-stakes mafia warfare? Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken Victor's deal or handled Gideon yourself? Share this video with a friend who loves a ruthless comeback story.